My name is Jim Ryan, and I'm the new instructional designer here at EWU. My job here is to take a look at the programs, courses, and people from a different point of view, to see how all these Lego pieces fit, and to imagine how I can help put them together differently to make something new and amazing. Welcome to the Play to Learn podcast. Today, I'm meeting with Dr. Philip Appel. He's a serial entrepreneur, Defense Department contractor, materials scientist, and instructor of mechanical and fluid dynamics here at Eastern Washington University. He is passionate about storytelling and active learning in the classroom. So, sit back, relax, and enjoy. So, I get to be here today with Philip Appel, one of the first instructors that I met here at Eastern Washington University, and the one I think I've been bugging the most ever since I was hired, dropping in unannounced just to say hi. But I've been meaning to do this podcast for a while because you have just shown me all these different amazing things you do here at Eastern Washington University to inspire your students. You use active learning. You do all these hands-on events and things and tours. But before we even get to that point, can you just tell us a little bit about your history, like how you came to be from child on up? Let's hear about Philip Appel.
All right. Well, so I did grow up locally. I grew up in a little town called Colfax, south of here. Actually grew up in a little place called Dusty. So if anybody that ever drives through Dusty, driving from Colfax towards Seattle, there's a little bump on the road with a restroom and a gas station. That's where I grew up. But I grew up as a farm kid on a wheat, barley, and hay operation. And we had a whole bunch of sheep while we were at it. So I worked very hard from very young. We were a very poor family, and we raised all of our own food. So we had a very large garden. We had the sheep, and we had some cattle. That was our meat source. And then we would trade those with a neighbor who had pigs. And so we went grocery shopping up here in Spokane whenever we sold sheep, so Dad would have enough money to go to the warehouse food. The reason I bring that up is because we worked really, really hard. From the time I was 6, I spent my summers in the garden, weeding the garden, snapping beans and shelling peas and picking corn and digging potatoes, so that we put up and we canned all of our own food and all of our own vegetables. And so if you want to call it an entrepreneurship, you can. But it's basically, Mom made sure we fed the family. We did not buy food at the grocery store. Toothpaste, yes. Toilet paper, yes. But everything else was raised. By the time I was 14, I was driving wheat and hay truck because we had the ag permits. So I was at 14 years old. I'm working 12 hours a day. I was in the tractors the rest of the time at that age, and knowing that I'm going to put in a 14-hour day every Saturday. And so during the summers, it was a 12 to 14-hour day every day. So you develop a hardworking mentality in that kind of environment. But because of all the hard work myself and my brothers and my father, that farm's worth millions of dollars now. But at the time, we were barely getting by. We were well below the poverty standard. I tell the story in some of my classes about the fact that my favorite Christmas was when I was about 6 years old. I got 3 pairs of brand new wool socks. I was so excited. I didn't get toys. I just got the 3 pairs of socks. You know why I'm so excited? It's because that was the very first pair of socks that weren't worn by my brother. Okay? Getting brand new socks, that was such an amazing thing. We would look at my kid siblings that were 15 years younger. They had these giant Christmases filled full of presents and, more of a traditional American family. But I look back, and the thing that changed Dad's life was he got a loan from the Small Business Administration to get new equipment and expand the farm. And I use that when I'm teaching my entrepreneur classes. The access to capital changes your future. When you can get capital, when you can get a loan, your business explodes. But until you get that, it's never going to happen. And that lesson is carried forward, and I share that before I talk about the rest of it, because it's been kind of a guiding principle throughout my life of we need to work hard. We need to work very hard, and you need access to that capital to grow. So I went to college, started in electrical engineering, made it through almost half a semester before realizing I hated it. Went in mechanical engineering. I made it through a semester before realizing I didn't like mechanical engineering, which is kind of a joke. And then switched into materials science, which is much harder but they offered me a full scholarship, and the classes were only 12 people in the classroom. I thrived when there was only 12 people in the classroom, and I learned about how to learn at that point, in that the professors would sit down at a table with us to teach. It wasn't a lecture. They were our friends who were helping us out. We would go to a study lounge, all 12 of us, and the faculty member oftentimes would come in and sit down with us and teach us what we needed to know. We're working on our homework. They helped us with our homework in the student lounge. And we were calculating, I remember X-ray diffraction, calculating that by hand before there was a computer. Very, very long, complicated calculations, and we'd get lost all the time. And Professor Stevens would come in, sit down with us, and help us do all our homework, and then grade it right there on the spot. So what you saw in my lecture earlier this quarter, I learned that from Professor Stevens. You go in and you sit down at a table when you have a small group of people, and you work hand to hand with them, giving examples, taking us into the lab, showing stuff. We'd be working in the lecture hall, working on the problems. And he goes, let's go down to the lab. And he'd go down to the lab to demonstrate the concept that he was presenting in class. This is in the early 80s. And he was doing experiential learning right then. And that addicted me to the concept of teaching. So from there, I went on and started doing research with some of the faculty members during the summer. Got kind of hooked on that too. I paid a lot of my bills by driving semi. Still had that. I could make good money driving wheat down to Snake River from Colfax. I could make $100 a day during Thanksgiving break, during Christmas break, during spring break. Tuition at the time was $800 a semester. A lot better than it is now down there. You could actually afford to live at WSU at the time at $3,500 a year. But I made all that driving semi. And then during the summer, I would drive combines and semi, maintaining that hard work ethic. That carried me into, and the government shut down in 88. And in the winter of 88, Newt Gingrich shut down the government for the very first time. And I graduated that December. Couldn't get a job anywhere. Nobody was hiring because the government was shut down. And my neighbor was a professor at University of Idaho. And their material science professor just got hired on to be the director of the NSF for the next 3 years. So he left. And he goes, we need a material scientist in a week. What are you doing in a week? And I said, well, currently unemployed, just graduated. So they hired me on to teach material science at University of Idaho as a master's student.
Wow.
Just luck of the draw. And I was given 3 classes to teach. And this is in January of 89. And they started me at $23,000 a year, teaching full-time during the academic year. And then I stumbled into a faculty member looking for a material science student to help him with his lead-acid battery project for General Motors, for the EV1, which is the very first electric car for General Motors. And I started doing research with him, and he paid me an additional $17,000 a year to do research full-time. I'm making really good money. Okay, keep in mind, this is $40,000 a year as a graduate student at University of Idaho in the early 80s. Why would I want to go to industry? That's what I get paid in industry. So I stayed. My dad kept telling me, you need to quit and go back to industry. No, I'm making good money here. No, so finished up the master's. Took me 3 years because I was working full-time, teaching. Then International Lead Zinc Research Organization sent me another grant on top of all that to do my PhD. It was an international award. I'm enjoying grad school, making good money. So I finished up my PhD in lead-acid batteries, and we built an electric car using General Motors parts from their EV1. And those idiots at General Motors killed the electric car. You guys have all watched the movie. I know those people. I still don't like them. And so at that point, about that, as I was graduating, I recently got married, and she had another year of law school. And so I was looking for a local company to get me employed. I had a job offer at Pasadena, California, continuing battery development for General Motors on their electric vehicle line, but they just killed the electric vehicle line. So anyway, this company had 4 employees. His name, Isothermal Systems Research. And so I joined him as one of early adopters and considered kind of one of the founders because I helped develop the technology. They were just getting started. And I started there as one of their scientists. Lots of stories there, but we started building toys for the intelligence agencies. We were using a misted liquid cooling directly on the electronics, pulling the power out. And we were able to pull out power orders of magnitude higher than anyone else in the world. utilizing the technology we developed, which means you could crank the power up on a computer chip by 10 times. By the time we finished doing our science development, we were pulling out 500 watts per square centimeter. Current chips today are 5 watts. We were at 500. So we put a Cray J90 supercomputer on a U-2 aircraft. That was kind of fun. Then as we got the intelligence agencies, we built a lot of toys for them. I don't know what they did. I don't care. Don't know where they went. But during that time period, we ended up picking up some development work for the U.S. Army and for the U.S. Air Force. And the company exploded. And we went from 30 employees to 130 in less than 2 years. And I was managing a quarter of the employees, getting a little bit burned out, traveling 75% of the time around the country. And we got a big investment from venture capitalists, which is why I teach all of my students to stay away from them. And the venture capitalist said we could stop working for the military and go private. And I left because U.S. military paid far better. They had a far greater need, and there was no need for our technology. The liquid we used was $300 a gallon. You can't use a $300 a gallon liquid against a $9 aluminum heat sink. That's just math, just doesn't work. And yes, within a few years, I left in 2004 to go to Gonzaga. I'd been there since 95. And a half dozen years later, the company folded and was gone. And that's because they decided to go commercial and abandon the military. There's many, many stories that I'm not going to share with you, but I taught at Gonzaga for 5 years doing alternate energy for third world countries and was having a lot of fun with that. But I wasn't a good fit for Gonzaga. I didn't like the way they treated the students, and I didn't like the way the administration behaved, and it just wasn't a good fit for me. So I was talking to one of my investors from the first startup from ISR, and he said, "I'll give you $300,000 if you start another company." I said, "Well, what do you want me to do?" He goes, "I don't give a crap. Go start another company. You're good at it." So I did. I sat around and got together with an old friend of mine that I'd helped, who was also hired the same time I was at ISR, and both of us weren't happy where we're at, and sat around a campfire and shared a bottle, and we were up on top of Eagle Cap Mountain, out in the middle of nowhere, big bonfire, sharing a bottle of whiskey, and we came up with Ag Energy. And I'm sorry, I'm making you laugh on that one, but that is the truth of how it came out. I'm not going to. We were kind of good. We got to do something better.
It's the best story. We just were drinking by the campfire, so we came up with the company. And
well, it's 20 miles in to get there, so we'd hike for a couple days to get there, and decided to split a bottle and come up with an idea for a new job. I really encourage it. It's a great way to find out how to do what you want to be. I remember it was midsummer, big full moon over the top of the mountains and the lake. It was so gorgeous. And we were just talking about how beautiful. Anyway, so Ag Energy is based on, I have a history degree on top of all of this. I didn't mention, but I enjoy history. And I was looking at how the Germans were able to produce fuel during World War II out of wood and coal. Could we use the excess wheat straw in all these fields around here to make gasoline and diesel? And that was the first that was Ag Energy. And after a bunch of analysis and getting some funding to get kicking into it, we realized, yes, we could, for $15 a gallon. So we figured out that we can make the diesel fuel for $15 a gallon out of wheat straw. That's not competitive. But we had syngas in between before we catalyzed it, which is hydrogen gas and carbon monoxide, which is also called city gas. And every city in the United States ran on city gas in the 1880s through the 1940s. So that city gas was pumped to your home, and you use it to heat your home, you use it to cook your fuel on, and it was made from wood and coal. And we could make the same thing from wheat straw. And that gas you could cook with, you could actually run it into a car engine. And we found a manual from FEMA on how to convert your tractor to run on wood gas. Yes, straw gas and wood gas are the same thing. And so we go, oh, well, let's not make the liquid fuel, just leave it gaseous and put it into a generator and use the straw underneath a pivot circle sprinkler to power the electricity to run the sprinkler. Mathematics showed that there was more straw underneath the pivot sprinkler than we needed to run it for a year. So we started going down that path. We were throwing all the ash away. And a farmer came up and offered me $1,500 for it, a ton. He says, when you put that black char back out in the field, I get a lot more yield. So we did some testing and found, it increased the yield of wheat by 15%. And so $1,500 was a really good rate of return. So we thought, okay, well, we're going to sell this char to wheat farmers for $1,500 a ton. Well, an acquaintance of mine was growing marijuana at the time. It was legal, 502 grower or 442, whatever, I don't remember the number. Anyway, but he was growing marijuana, and he said, can I try that on my marijuana? So he tried it on some of his plants and doubled his yield. Well, he was making $1,000 per plant, and all of a sudden he's making $2,000 a plant. And he said, well, I will buy it from you for $80 a cubic foot. Okay. $80 a cubic foot is $18,000 a ton. And so we stopped producing electricity. We converted over to selling to the marijuana industry. And right now that business is still going, selling to the grape industry, where we can cut off 2 years of growth on the grapes before harvest. The apple industry, where we cut off a year of growth before they can harvest apples. Spinach is doubling in yield, mushrooms, all kinds of plants are selling it all over the place. And Ag Energy was merged with Phytelligence and Pullman, our primary investors, the Cole family, and the primary investor down there was the Cole's family. And now there's a company by the name of Qualterra, which owns both Phytelligence and Ag Energy. And they're still off and running. But again, after 9 years, I'm kind of burned out of being CEO and had enough. And I started doing consulting. I stepped down, got a new CEO to take the company and make it grow. My wife at the time was a bookkeeper for startups, and she had 33 startup companies she did the books for. So I started being their mentor and teaching them how to grow their businesses. And then we realized we needed health insurance between the two of us, and I joined Eastern. And then when she and I separated, she took her clients and said I couldn't have them anymore. So it's okay. Her clients were hers to begin with, and I just started helping them. But anyway, that got me the bug of doing the coaching of new businesses on a mass scale. And so I got here at Eastern and worked a couple years and ran into Bruce Teague, who was running the eShip Center. And also ran into Janelle Husserlid and Chris Tilia and a number of others who were running the EXP program. Bruce Teague was also working with the EXP, but he was sending people out to the experiential classroom through his program. And its experiential classroom is about how to be an experiential teacher, teaching the concepts of entrepreneurship, which I already had an addiction for. And so I went to the first conference and it was like drinking from a fire hose. I couldn't learn enough. I couldn't learn it fast enough. When I came back, I started helping Bruce run the entrepreneurial program here. And then he announced in 2020 that he was moving out to Florida. And so I took over the eShip program here on Eastern. It used to be called the Entrepreneurship Center. But I found that nobody in the administration could spell entrepreneurship, let alone our students spell it. And the provost at the time agreed that we could call it the eShip Center, just so it would be misspelled so often. And that's not a joke. When we look at the program at the time was servicing only business students. And there was one program that was started that failed miserably. It was called the Technology Commercialization Program. We took that program from an 8-week summer program into a 20-week academic program. And that turned it on its head. Under the 8-week program, it failed miserably and no student businesses were launched. When we brought it back into the engineering building and promoted it across campus, had students from all over campus participating in it and experientially learning how to start a business, meeting with me in the evenings on a volunteer basis. It's not a class. I paid them $1,000 if they participated and finished it. And I taught them how to start the businesses, and we worked one-on-one with each of them. We brought in experts from industry. We brought in other faculty members, and I started the teaching with the kickoff week, and then brought in my other associates such as Chris Tilia and Janelle and other people on campus, Eldana Davis, as well as over 300 people out of the Spokane community. And they were our judges. They were our mentors. They were our trainers. And this became a concerted effort. And since I took over in 2020, we've started 65 businesses. And our success rate after 1 year, after they go through the program, are they still in business 1 year later? We're currently running 50%. National average is 5%.
That's amazing success.
It's successful not because of me. Let's be clear. It's because of our community members. It's because of the other faculty members on campus. It's also because during this time period, with the funding from Herbert B. Jones, we built one of the best makerspaces of any of the 7 that I've toured. I've seen 7 universities that have been bragging about their makerspaces, and I went and looked at them. I took the best of all of them and incorporated them into ours. We have a far bigger, far better makerspace than any other university I've been to. We call it the Ideation Lab. We focus on innovation through play. Come and play, and then that teaches you to innovate. And once you get innovating, then we're going to start a business. We're going to find something the students are passionate about and then pursue it. And that approach is different than everyone else because everyone else uses a standard business model approach. We don't get to the business model until we get to a minimum viable prototype. We don't talk about a business model until you have something that works, that somebody wants. Then we figure out how to make it work as a business. And so we've inverted this. This is a program I've worked with Bruce Stieg very closely with. Even after he moved down to Florida, we still talk on a very, very regular basis about how to run this program. And he's a business faculty member. I'm an engineering faculty member coming from 2 different points of view, but I've also run multiple startups that have been successful and coached a lot of businesses that are successful. Utilizing all that experience, utilizing Bruce's experience, who is also an entrepreneur who is very successful. We're taking it from that point. We succeeded these businesses not because of a huge amount of capital. Both of us did it with almost no capital. And that's the key. When you sell your equity, you lose control. So we teach the students how to maintain control, maintain directional control, technical control of their companies in the first few years so they get the company they want without somebody else telling them how to do it. And that is why we're succeeding. So that's why I ended up where I'm at now. You asked me how I got here? Yeah, I came here because we were living in Cheney and I was living on Fish Lake in this great big CEO house and kind of saying, okay, my wife and I need insurance. And we parted ways a few years later. But after that happened, I'm here already. I have an income. I have a job. But then that job changed when I met Bruce.
I think the way I framed it that way is because in your history course, you have the students do an exercise of how they got here.
Yes, I do. And so when we talk about experiential learning, I've gone to experiential classroom twice now. It's expensive to go. And I've used our grant when I've been managing it to send 4 people a year since 2020. And Bruce sent 4 people a year prior to that from 16 to 20. So the 4 years that he ran it. And there's a bunch of faculty members on campus that have gone and learned tremendous amount. Drank from a fire hose as they taught you how to teach experientially and why that's important. My experience goes all the way back to Professor Stevens, back at Washington State University in the 80s, where he sat down and we learned experientially. You sat through my classes and saw me teaching in a large classroom. And how do you make that experiential when we're teaching about, when what I'm covering is a history of technology? Do I actually have to have them go out and physically pick something up? Or do I have to make it relatable to something in their life? And the key is to make it tie the class to their life, tie the class to their experiences, so they can tie their experience to what they're learning. Okay? So as I'm teaching the history of the zipper, you realize that's a very fun, all of them have a zipper. So let's go through an example of what would happen if you didn't have zippers. Somebody raised their hand and said, we'd all be using buttons still. That's true. Okay? But how much better is a zipper on your backpack, on your snow pants, on your boots? And they start thinking about all the different places they use zippers in their life, from their lunch bag to their backpack, right? Today we went in my class, we talked about the history of food preservation, but not just the use of salt throughout Europe. Food preservation in the pioneer times in the United States, we didn't have the salt. What was the technology we used?
Boiling?
Canning.
Yeah, canning, yeah.
So canning was a big push started with Napoleon, but then really took off as we moved across the United States, where we didn't have a lot of water. We didn't have any salt. We couldn't use the traditional methods of food preservation, and we were moving all the time. And so they can go, yeah, I've got canned foods in my kitchen, right? They see that, and they can, oh, yeah, that's part of my world. Well, here's where it came from. So when you were coming into my fluids class, and we got a very small class, and fluids for mechanical engineering technology students, we only have 4 of them this quarter We have to run it because they need it to graduate. Well, I went back to Professor Stevens' method. We sit around a table. We open up the textbook and we start walking through, talking about the concepts in the textbook, utilizing real-world examples of what they're talking about. So we were talking about parallel fluid systems today. Well, where are their parallel fluid systems? In the roof of the room, to run all the sprinkler systems, to run all the bathrooms, to run all the sinks. And then we started talking about Eric's water system in his house, which is leaking like a sieve. But at the same point, it was designed wrong. And we talked about why it was designed wrong. What was wrong with the design? Why didn't it not work? And why this pipe was outsized and that pipe should have been... But they could then tie that directly. And then tomorrow we're going to go in the lab and we're going to build a parallel system. When we're going through this, we talk about it. We tie it to the real world, something they've seen, something they've touched, something they've done in the classroom. And then we take them into the lab and we have them build a parallel fluid system, calculate what the pressure drop should be, and then validate whether or not it actually, then measure it, go, yep, it works. Calculations work, right? But that gets them tied in. They already know what their final is. I just hadn't told them exactly how they have to do it. But I told them, you're going to design an irrigation system for a farmer. I'm going to have you go pump water out of a river. You're going to go up a large hill. And then you're going to use some sort of irrigation system. There's dozens out there. So they already know what the problem is. But they can't get started on it because they don't know how much water, how big a pump, where it's located, what the hill is, what kind of sprinkler. I told them that on day one. So I said, by the time you finish this class, you're going to be able to do a real world example. That's your final. Something you would have to do when you graduate. So they've known about it from the beginning. But can they go out and study it in advance? Too many options. Way too many options. Each irrigation system is custom to that location. So they can't get started. They can think about it. They can dream about it. Or in Steve's case, you can be terrified of it. Right? How the heck am I going to do this? You better learn chapter 11. One of the other things I think that faculty members on campus don't realize, monotone drone lectures lose students. If you don't put yourself into the driver's seat, if you are not passionate about teaching, you're going to fail as a teacher. You have to be passionate about teaching. It needs to be your vocation to be a really effective experiential teacher. To walk in there and read the slides is torture. I think it should be against the Geneva Convention. I've seen that from so many faculty members. Literally go in, they put the slide up and read the slide to the students. I'm sorry, they're bright enough to know how to read. They share no stories of their past. They share no stories of the current or the present. They share no stories from history that ties that subject to today, to the student's real world, to where they can understand it. And until you can make that connection of their experiences and what you're trying to connect, they don't. So what people don't understand, experiential learning is not about physically picking up tools, physically picking up clay. It's being able to make the connection of their experiences with the lessons being taught. So talking about parallel flow and plumbing and why all the lines have the same pressure, it took me about 15 minutes using various different examples, and suddenly Doug's eyes light up. Oh, now I get why it behaves that way. But I had to use examples of things that he's been around in order to make that connection of why that's true. And once you can picture why it's true, and once you could see where he's actually seen that without realizing that's what he was looking at, then he's going to go, oh, that makes so much more sense. That's real experiential learning. So I hope the faculty members, when we talk about Polytechnic, they're terrified of the term. Polytechnic is experiential learning. It's the same thing. Can you tie your lesson to something they've already seen? One of our philosophy professors was talking about an assignment. He made the students go take a hike through Turnbolt, find a quiet place and sit down and write up the philosophy of where they were. What are you experiencing? And what a great experiential learning. And asked him, where are your students getting employed? He goes, what's really funny is the Forest Service likes philosophy majors because it can talk to anybody. I said, that's a really great point. He says they use them for tour guides. We were joking. All right. But at the same point, it's not joking. But the thing is to take them out there in the world. And one faculty member was talking about an assignment where she made the students go out and meet a squirrel on campus, sit down, watch the squirrel, and imagine what's going through its mind and write an essay about it. That's an experiential. You're experiencing, what did this squirrel experience while you were sitting there? This damn human didn't bring any peanuts. Whatever it is, right?
I'm sure it's got like at least 3 or 4 variables involved.
Or at least they didn't bring a dog this time. But but when you're getting there, if your students are laughing in class, not because you're a comedian, but because they're tying it to themselves and they're enjoying the lecture, they will never forget the lecture. Therefore, they will do well on the exam. A student who's asleep will never remember anything that you're talking about. Okay. So experiential learning has to be about, if you bring the class to them, the concept to them, what happens is they become engaged in the class and the class becomes theirs. So you experience that very large room, history of technology, and you sat in the early part of the class and we're talking, I can't remember exactly what the topic was at the time.
It was one of the first assignments where you wanted to have them take a concept. What was it? I can't remember.
Oh, what is a technology that occurred first in the last 100 or so years?
Yes, that's what.
And the impact it had on.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
One of the students got so excited about that subject, he was supposed to do no more than 6 pages. I got an 18-page paper on paper plates and picnicking. I'm not joking it. Oh, he really got it. He goes, "Do you know the history of this?" And he was so enamored with the history of the picnic and how we ended up with paper plates.
That's cool. Like, you got somebody when they only have to do 6 pages and do 3 times as much
about paper plates.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, it's a really good article. Okay, he wrote really well. He dove it. I mean, I'm fascinated. Okay, so who started the idea of the picnic? Okay, for your podcast, does anybody know? A gentleman by the name of King, who was a charcoal maker, and his buddy by the name of Ford, who had a whole bunch of wood he needed to get rid of from all his pallets from his car manufacturing assembly. And the two of them got together and made a product called Kingston's Charcoal, right? They had another friend who made barbecues with the last name of Weber. And so when you got an early Model T, they put a Weber barbecue in the back and a bag of Kingsford charcoal, so you would use your car to go out and have a picnic with your family.
That's genius.
According to the student, I haven't checked his references yet, but according to what he had in his paper, ties the whole thing together. Well, what's the problem with it? Now you get to clean the dishes. Anyway, so the whole history of the idea of the picnic comes from a car manufacturer who wants you to use your car. A man who was taking waste product out of the car manufacturing, making charcoal, and he wanted to sell it, but he needed to burn the charcoal in something. That's called entrepreneurship. By the way, he is one of my entrepreneurial students. So when we're looking at this, did you see how he experienced that whole thing? And one young man wrote a great paper on the history of gasoline, which is not what you think it is. It was rather interesting. It's a waste product from the extraction of artificial flavoring. They were dumping gasoline in rivers because they didn't know what to do with it. Artificial flavoring is derived from petroleum oil.
I knew it was from oil. I didn't know that it was from artificial flavoring.
Artificial flavoring is from petroleum oil.
Jeez.
And the stuff's currently worth like $3,500 a gallon. So gasoline is a waste product. So as the students dive into it, they start talking together. Now they're talking about, did you know? And you ought to hear the conversation at the beginning of class. Each one of them came up with a different topic and are sharing them back and forth.
So it's communal learning.
It's communal learning, yes. So I allow the conversation at the beginning of the class to go for a while as they're talking about their projects. And they're just having a ball, right? They talk after class about the stuff they're learning because now it becomes camaraderie through shared experience. Right now, this assignment is, how did you get in my class? And I want you to go all the way back to, no matter who you are, at some point, your ancestors came to the continental United States. How did they get here and from where and why? Even if you're indigenous, we got to talk about why they migrated out of the Siberian and Manchurian area. Okay. If you're black and they were involved in the slave trade and forced over here. If you're white, there's all these different migrations that went on. And there's as many different stories as our students. But as they're going back and they're meeting the grandparents for the first time, that's one of the students made a comment. They got to experience grandma, and she got to talk about her story and her ancestor story, how they got here. Because it isn't written down for most families. And so they said, this is actually one of the most fun things they ever did. One student put in their paper, I discovered grandma. Now, that's experiential learning beyond the classroom. But now they're learning about themselves, and guess what they're doing? They're back to sharing in the classroom.
Well, it's making them kind of the main character in their own adventure.
Yes, but it makes them the main character in their own adventure, but it also says this class is about me. And grading's simple because I can't tell that their family was wrong. All I can say is I give them a question. Did you ask this? Did you tell me how you got to the United States? Did you tell me how you got to Cheney? And why did you end up in my classroom? If you covered those 3 things, you get a full points, right? Actually, there's 6 things that I ask. But as long as you cover those, checks marks off in the rubric, it makes it easy to grade. Because I'm not grading about whether it's right or wrong. I'm getting them to do the experience. They already have hard enough exams. This is one of those easy point things. But it's an easy point thing for the purpose of tying them into the classroom. Tying them into, I belong here and this is my story. And now they got that experience. They won't forget this class. I have students who, I've been teaching it this way for some time. And students from the first time I did it come back and say, I still remember doing that project about my family. They never forget that assignment. It's like I don't forget about the assignments that Dr. Stevens had back in the 80s. I mean, he really taught us a lot about material science. Not exactly the most exciting thing in the world, but as he tied it into the fun things that he was doing, he tied it into the world around us. I remember all of those stories. I share some of those stories in my materials class. They stayed with me, but they stayed with me because he tied the story of his industrial experience to the lecture materials that we were doing. I could see what he was talking about. When Professor Mason at that time was having us do the corrosion analysis on aluminum and stainless steel. And the example we're using was a pig farm in Colton, Washington that fell down and resulted in a lawsuit that he was involved in. So we were helping, I didn't realize this at the time, we were helping him go and do the analysis for a lawsuit. But the thing was, we were doing a real world analysis. I still remember that. I still remember doing all that work. And I know corrosion, and I learned a lot about corrosion in that experience.
Yeah, because if kids don't have a context for why they're learning the thing, what is going to keep them interested in remembering that?
Right. And that's the whole point of experiential learning. Having a context that ties back to them so they can say, this is why I'm doing this. It has a purpose. It has a reason. And my world is affected by that reason. What I'm going to do or what I'm doing now or what I've done in the past can be tied directly to that reason.
The worst answer you can get as a student from a teacher when you ask, why do I have to learn calculus? So you can go into calculus 2.
Yeah.
Well, what? Yeah, but when am I ever going to use this? That's the question that every student asks. When am I going to use this? How does this apply to me?
Yeah, and I do go visit the math classes, and that I went last quarter to visit with one of the math classes to explain why they need to know how to do matrices. And I went in there and I used a pie example. Let's say I have a restaurant and I serve 3 kinds of pie. I charge a different price for each pie. And I sell X number of pies per week of each type. Well, that's pretty simple math. It takes about a half a page. Or I put it in a matrix and I'm done in 2 minutes, right? So it can show how it can really make your world in business a lot faster. And I was trying to find something that was non-engineering based. So we use pies. Pies are good.
Yeah, everybody likes pies.
Yeah, exactly. And pies for breakfast. History of technology.
Yep.
When was a pie invented?
Oh, God.
Late 1800s.
Okay.
Well, actually, it's been around longer than that. But in the late 1800s, according to the Betty Crocker cookbook, pie was served as breakfast food. You cooked it the day before, so you had nice fruit and pastry for breakfast the next day. And when it was in the advent of ice cream, the pie was transferred into dessert. When you put ice cream on top of it, it suddenly became dessert. So my brother and I, we found that in the Betty Crocker cookbook. And when I was helping my brother out farming on his farm, we convinced his wife that we had a pie every morning for breakfast.
Well, you should look up Edward Bernays and where bacon came from.
Oh.
Bacon and eggs came from, because before him, there was no bacon for breakfast.
Oh, okay. Well, we've always had salt pork, though, but not necessarily bacon. Yes, smoked bacon, yeah. But so when we're looking at the passion teaching and what you came to ask me, you wanted to know, how do I engage the students experientially? And hopefully I've answered that for you, that experientially is not, as a lot of people on campus say, you have to go and create an experience. You don't have to have a physical thing for them to do. You can, That improves it. And for some concepts, you need to because they've never experienced this before. Experiential learning is tying your lesson to the experiences they've already had so they can understand why the experience that they had is applicable or to what the math that they're doing. So if I'm talking to a bunch of young men in a classroom in fluids, or young men and women, they're all men this quarter, and I have had women in the past, so I apologize for that one. But when we look at young men and women in a fluids class, and you say, how many of you have ever poured a beer in a glass? And everybody puts their hand in the air. How many of you have noticed that the beer bubbles all come from 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 little points, not from the entire surface? Why is that? And so I can then go through the calculations of the Gibbs free energy at the bottom of a crack is lower than it is on the outer surface. So therefore, it initiates a bubble formation at the bottom of the crack, and the bubble grows out the crack and then releases up to the surface. So an absolutely clean glass will have no bubbles. A dirty glass, which has lots of little cracks around all the dirt crud, bubbles like crazy. So when you go into a bar and your beer is bubbling like crazy, hand it back and say, please give me a clean glass.
Wow, that got me.
I've done that. And you know something? The bartender knows that a dirty glass will bubble a lot more. It makes your beer go flat faster. And then one student is always going to say, but why does Coca-Cola go all over? I said, because there's way too dang much energy in Coca-Cola. So it's forming all over the flat surfaces too. Beer doesn't have as much energy. So it becomes a better demonstration than a Coca-Cola or a Pepsi or a soda. But now that when I start talking about the Gibbs free energy in the bottom of a crack, they have something to tie it to. They've seen that. They've seen the bubbles coming out of that crack. They have an experience that they've had in the past. They can tie that to. So as you're going through that complex math, it makes total complete sense to them. Do you follow?
Absolutely. Yeah. I love
Even you'll understand it now, even though you don't know the math, because you can see that. You've seen that before. We don't need to know the math to understand when I have a clean glass and a dirty glass. But at the same time, when I'm trying to do the energy calculations associated with bubble formation, or associated with cracks, associated with crack growth, and all these other things associated with the energy of reaction. Now, all of a sudden, I can tie it to something I've seen. When you're talking about diffusion and the rate that material diffuses through fluid, actually, I'll go to a different example. Fluids, I've been teaching fluids all quarter, so I'm thinking about it. I was trying to explain the difference between laminar flow and turbulent flow, and they just couldn't get what laminar versus turbulent flow in water looked like. We went in the lab and we flowed water through a pipe with a little stream of red dye. And it was laminar. And then we turned up the flow until it became turbulent. And Steve goes, now it makes sense. But as soon as he saw it, the connections were there, right? And he and Doug had been struggling to figure out this whole laminar turbulent and Reynolds number garbage that this doesn't make any sense. But as soon as he saw it, oh, okay, now I'm done. So sometimes a very, very simple experiment is all that's necessary.
Yeah. I have a similar story to that happened just yesterday, ironically enough. So, I mean, you know about the Tesla turbine and pump that I've been working on with my buddy, and I haven't really been able to understand the relationship between the discs and torque and speed and what it all relates to. And then the image came into my head of a lever.
Yeah.
Because if you have a lever on a fulcrum and you want to move an object in a direction from there, you have to push down the lever. Well, the shorter the lever, the more force you have to put down in order to push that object. Well, if you take that lever and you spin around really fast, you basically have a disc shape.
Yeah.
And then if you have a smaller disc shape, in order to put in rotational energy, you have to put in more energy in order to get that thing moving. But if you have a larger disc, you don't have to put as much energy.
And what's funny part is it's a square of the length.
Yeah, and again, I'm not the math guy.
But it's a huge difference is what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
And just a simple experiment can do that, right? I asked the students which drains faster, a square hole in a bucket or a round hole in a bucket. So I took a bucket and we drilled a round hole in it and we cut a square hole in it, both the same area. Went into the sink, put tape over the top of them, filled them with hole, pulled the tape off, see which one end seeds faster. Is that a complex experiment? No. But suddenly when we talk about discharge coefficient and the difference of shape on discharge of the tank, now it's simple. Simple little experiments that only last a few minutes can clarify so much in a classroom. And that is the experimental part of teaching. You're not tying it to an experience. You're tying it to an experiment that gives them the experience that makes it work.
And y'all get to learn together sometimes.
Oh, yeah. Well, this quarter with only 4 people. Yeah, we're all learning together. We have a great time in there. But that also means you drop some of the barriers of teaching. But you've also seen when we get it into a larger classroom, we can maintain that enthusiasm, we can maintain that energy, but it's not as central. So you do it as a group instead of as individuals that are working together. You got this group. But what I'm trying to stimulate through assignments is external conversations between the students from a shared experience of writing these papers. And then that gets them excited about the concept. Are the papers really adding to their knowledge base? Not as much as is keeping them engaged. And I didn't tell you the third one that to get, and they're all laughing about. Compare the potato famines to Indian peoples. So the potato famines, which caused everybody to mass exodus out of Ireland, and the disaster that occurred in Ireland, and all the people that didn't support him. What if somebody fired off an EMP above the United States, which would fry every electronics? We've had enemies threaten to do that. Everything electronic won't work. So if we take away our technology, what would that happen? What would happen to our society? And no, you can't just say that we are screwed. Actually, they use a little more blunt term. I had one student literally turn that in on a paper. We'd be fucked. And I said, no, that's not a paper. But he's right. But what would happen? How would we respond without the technology crutches that we have now? Now, the students aren't really sure. You ought to see the discussions going on about that paper right now. Well, what are you going to put in there? Well, I don't know what would happen. But it's causing thought, it's causing discussion. And as long as I'm getting discussion and thought, they're paying attention to the class. And as they're paying attention to the class, they do better in the exams.
Well, I really hope that anybody listening to this understands this concept, because I really think it's one of the most powerful tools that we have. And it's like being able to come in and see you perform live, I guess you could say, was just amazing. And seeing all these things that you've built up and the direction you're moving has just been really incredible. And I hope a lot of people would take a look at this and see that they can emulate this in their own classroom and generate that same kind of inspiration.
But keep in mind, this is my 20th year of teaching. This is not something I created overnight.
No.
And I've been studying pedagogy throughout my academic careers over the last 38 years, 37 years, whatever the hell it is. And then when we get into where I'm really focusing as a professional development, once I got to Eastern, was now that I know I have all these small classes, how do I make the best of that small class? But also as I got into the experiential classroom years ago and got to go take that tour in 2019, that changed me in how I see my role as a faculty member. My role, I've always been a dynamic teacher. That's true. But now I'm looking at that dynamics and how do I get them to talk to each other and how do I tie it into them? And this takes time. And I encourage any young faculty member who wants to go down this path, go to experiential classroom, go to training programs, go to conferences on pedagogy and on experience-based learning. Many textbooks out there on experience-based learning. But the best way to do it is go out and watch those who are good. Watch how they teach. Sit in on a classroom. There's not just me on campus who teaches this way. There's many good faculty members on this campus. We are far more focused on experiential learning than any other university I've been to. Find those that are good. Find those that are really engaging and just observe. Sit in through a couple days. You learned a lot just one day sitting in my classroom. And there's others like me on campus that are very engaging faculty. Go sit in and watch them. And when you do that, emulate somebody successful. But when you emulate, you can't be them. You have to be yourself. No one's going to teach like me except for me. But can they look at what I'm doing and say, I can make my own version of that, and then be successful?
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think that's a fantastic note to end on. And Philip, I just want to say thank you again so much for taking the time.
Oh yeah, happy to. Let me know how else I can help.
Always will.